right, good morning, everybody. How's it going? Good week so far? All right, well, I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for our hosts and this amazing space. This is my first time here, actually. Very, very nice little environment. I have to be back. Maybe get a room here and rent some space. All right, so my name is Dr. Anna Maria Sacconi. I'm an assistant professor at SLU, and I'll be talking to you about cybersecurity for entrepreneurs. So let's just dive in. So first, I'm going to give you a very brief introduction of what cybersecurity is. We're going to talk about very briefly about what the threat landscape of today looks like for entrepreneurs and what types of threats you need to look out for. I'm going to talk about why you as an entrepreneur should care about this topic. Then I'm going to walk you through my 7 steps guide that I came up with. That's just a simplified guideline among all the different and confusing things that you should probably start preparing for when it comes to cybersecurity and your startup. And then finally, we'll discuss a couple of smaller points as you think about growth and try to mature your organization. So before we do that, though, I'd like to talk about the CIA a little bit. And when I say CIA, I don't mean the organization, I mean the CIA triad. When I say CIA triad, I mean confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. Because when we talk about cybersecurity, this triad is really what we're trying to focus on. So we're trying to protect the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of data. We're trying to protect our systems, we're trying to protect our devices from all these outside attacks that happen in today's world. So let's talk a little bit about how these threats look like. For this, I usually like to consult already existing robust sources that do this research for us and help us understand how that looks like. So Verizon, for example, has a really good report that they issue every year. It's called the Data Breach Investigations Report. So for 2023, they identified that 74% of these threats include some kind of a human element. So this can range from human errors and mistakes to privilege misuse, so using their accounts to do something that they were not supposed to do, and actual outside attacks. So let's talk a little bit about these actual attacks and how those look like when we're focusing on the human element. So does anybody know what phishing is? Can you tell me with your own words what phishing is? Yep, yeah, exactly. Malicious actors trying to get your information, right? So they send you a link and you click on that link either to get your credentials and information or maybe have you download something that's malicious. So that's what phishing, it comes through email. Do you know what the version is when it comes through a phone call? What is it called? What the cyber term for it is? What is it? No? It's called phishing, so voice phishing. All right, so I think it's going to be easy for the third one. Do you know what it is called when it comes through a text message? Spam texting. Okay, that too, but smishing. All right, good. Yeah, exactly. It's called smishing. You see the pattern there, right? So these are the different techniques that attackers usually use when we talk about human elements. So it's the human who's the target to be able to get some kind of information that then they're going to exploit in their attack. These types of situations usually happen through social engineering and pretexting. So social engineering is when the attacker creates and entices some kind of action from you by creating a situation that motivates you to that action. So for example, they are pretexting the situation being there's some kind of an urgency, or there's some kind of a reward or some kind of a situation where it really motivates you to respond in a certain way that they want you to respond. So that's social engineering. Doctors actually use social engineering when they want to motivate you to do healthier behaviors, for example. So it's not always bad, but unfortunately, that is the technique that cybersecurity actors utilize. Generally, the outcome is that they're able to steal credentials. So when you click on that link, you provide your information, and now they are able to access those systems. And business email compromise is another one. So for example, they pretend that they are the CIO of a certain company. They call one of the administrators to let them know, hey, you need to change your routing information for this and this vendor, because now they have a new bank account they just told me in a meeting. Your administrator does that, and now the money is transferred to the malicious actor. So these are the ideas and areas where we're talking about the human element. So there's also other types of attacks, so system intrusion, so tactical attacks when system is getting attacked. Ransomware is when they get into your systems and encrypt your data so you cannot get to it. So in these situations, they demand a ransom for you to pay for that, and then they give your money back. Data back if they give it back. There's also different technical attacks where they can exploit the vulnerabilities in your application. So for example, if you use some kind of a software and you do not patch it regularly, like you have a Microsoft Windows on your machine and you do not automatically patch those systems, then attackers can exploit those vulnerabilities. And finally, denial of service attacks. Those are the types of attacks when the attackers introduce so many different requests to your network that your network just cannot handle it and everything just shuts down. So again, these are the top types of threats that Verizon has seen that happen in today's world. So we're talking about the 2023, so previous year's data. So going back to that CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? So hashtag CIA fails. When these confidentiality and integrity protections do not work, what kind of situations can we talk about? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. For confidentiality, for example, we could talk about data breaches, right? So we've heard a lot of data breaches on the news. For example, Facebook and Equifax both had massive data breaches that made it into the news. So in these situations, some kind of confidential data that they have in their systems got exposed and ended up somewhere online. For integrity, we can talk about fraud and data manipulation related situations. So for example, in Florida, the water system back in 2021 was attacked by a malicious actor. And they modified the system in a way that they injected all kinds of malicious materials in the water. These materials are generally used to clean the water, but in higher amounts, these can be very, very dangerous for human life. Fortunately, they were able to capture this before anything happened. They had obviously multiple controls in place before it got to the actual users, but you can imagine what could have happened if it made it out into the public water system. Another example could be election manipulation. So election data manipulations, deep fakes and AI and all of these different things. We can hear about all of those. Availability. In terms of denial of service attacks, we can mention two big situations that are massive companies that are serving a lot of different clients to make sure that they have available networking and services. So both AWS, Amazon Web Services, and Cloudflare, which is another big provider, were attacked by a denial of service attack and actually caused outages at multiple top companies because of that. Finally, I want to mention ransomware because that's a very common tool and attack that is happening these days. And these are definitely something that you all need to be focused on as well. Howard University in 2021, for example, was a victim of a ransomware attack, and they actually had to shut down education for a couple of days, both online and in person. And then the Royal Mail scandal, we all heard about it in 2023. Hopefully, they were probably out of business for what, 2-3 weeks? I don't even remember. It was a very long, unfortunate situation because they didn't know how to respond. So let's talk about why this should be important to you. This same Verizon data breach report has identified the following statistics. In terms of entrepreneurs, so small, medium-sized businesses, so probably you, system intrusion, social engineering, and web application attacks. So system intrusion, so those types of technical attacks I mentioned earlier, social engineering, again, the human element, phishing, vishing, and all of those. And then finally, the web applications, so those vulnerabilities when you do not do the patching of your applications that you utilize. 94% of these are external. So again, those malicious attackers who come from the outside of your organization. However, we do see that internal number as well, which can potentially be caused by that human error and human involvement. And of course, 98% is financially motivated, so they're after your money. In terms of the data that is involved, data credentials are on the top of the list. Again, think about phishing, how they are able to exploit those credentials and get to them. And then internal, which is probably your sensitive data like customer data, financial data, so that they can take advantage and get financial gains from those. So in terms of cybersecurity and where you are as an entrepreneur, so why is that important? You know those threats right now, but so what? I get attacked and then what? So obviously you have your customer data, your financial data, and all of these sensitive records that are crucial to your operations. This is what really drives your brand image, right? This is the foundation of what you're trying to do. On top of that, you have your IP, and you have all of these business secrets that probably set you up with the competitive edge to be able to compete in the market. Add on top of that the regulations and the compliance requirements and the potential financial penalties if you do not meet those requirements. If, for example, you're in a HIPAA environment, or if you take any kind of financial transactions through credit cards, right? So obviously it's going to impact your bottom line, because if you get a financial penalty, that's not going to good look for you. And of course, your reputation, if you make it on the news like Facebook and AWS and all of these guys did. So, of course, cybersecurity should be a core component so that your company can stay sustainable and viable on the long run. So let's pause a little bit and think about how do startups and small businesses look like, because there are, of course, lots of limitations, right? So first of all, startups generally have limited resources, especially when you're starting out, you're just exploring, you do not have maybe venture capital, you don't have additional funders. So you have limited resources, so cost consciousness is very important for you. You maybe have one person IT department, if you even have anybody who's an IT person in your company. Of course, because of all of these reasons, you have limited skill sets, limited trainings. So you probably prefer outsourcing and buying things off the shelf versus doing those in-house, right? You probably use a lot of mobile devices. There's not a clear separation of what is your business device, what is your personal device. There's the gray area over there. Right now, you probably have a simple IT infrastructure, but then you try to scale, so you want to explore and grow. So how can you do that? And then, of course, cyber insurance is another aspect. Can you get a cyber insurance like this when you do not really know where to start, right? So that brings us to the next step. Where do we start? So you already made the first step. You're here. You're learning. So that's good. We talked about cyber threats. So you now have some information on where you need to focus. So that's really your first step. Understand what the overall environment, outside environment is looking like, and what are those threats that you as an entrepreneur can expect to happen to you. But then you probably also want to pause a little bit and think about risk and your personal and organization's risk. So I'm going to get into a super little math here. It's very simple. Risk is about impact and likelihood. So what is the impact of something happening? And what is the likelihood of it happening? So you multiply these two, and that's going to give you the risk, and you can put it into numbers. There's a deeper breakdown when we talk about vulnerability. So let me illustrate this as an example. When you look at that picture, it's a tire that's falling apart. Would you say that's a high risk? Yeah? Yeah. Why? Okay. Well, if it's on a car and maybe it's wet conditions, you know, it's probably very dangerous to drive on that. What if I told you that this tire was just hanging on that tree? Is that high risk? No? No more than usually is? What is it?
As long as the limb is strong.
Okay. Okay, yeah. So, you know, if everything's looking good, even though it's a worn tire, you sit on it, you swing a little, and that's it, good. But probably lower risk. What if that's what the rope looks like?
High risk.
High risk? What if you do not sit on that tire? Is it still high risk?
Yeah.
Okay, so what about the same rope, the same tire being on that swing? Would you sit on there? so, so your vulnerability is the rope, the frayed rope, right? If it's complete and intact, the vulnerability is probably low. Your threat is gravity itself. Like if gravity, you sit on it, gravity pulls, and the rope is snapped, you fall. So the impact is either you falling or not. So these will change depending on what the actual situation is. However, you also make some assumptions, right? Because we talked about the first image, that tire, if that tire is just sitting on a tree, it's not really a risk because nobody's sitting on it. Now, if that tire is on a car, somebody's sitting on it, maybe a teenager driving in on a wet road, then that's probably a big risk. So you are making a lot of assumptions as well, so you have to be conscious about what that is. But if we're talking about cybersecurity, now you understand some of those threats because we talked about this in the previous slides. And your vulnerability is your own systems, your data, your controls, your processes, and all of those that you have in your company, right? Then you can figure out, you can understand based on your own risk preferences what that impact would look like. And then there you got your risk. So when you do these calculations and considerations, you also have to think about obviously what your personal risk appetite is. So what is that amount of money? What is that reputation? What is all of that I'm willing to lose? Is this a business problem that is important for me or not? But also you have to consider your regulations. So if you're in HIPAA, for example, healthcare, for example, you have to follow HIPAA regulations. So there's a lot of confidentiality requirements, privacy requirements that you have to maintain. So there's hefty financial penalties for those. Is that something you can afford? Or maybe I don't care and I'll just pay the fine because it's too small that it costs me more to fix those systems, right? So all of these considerations you have to think about so that you can make educated decisions for the rest of what we're going to talk about. So you have your threats identified, you understand what the industry looks like, and you understand where your risk preferences are. And you may not start out with these exact calculations yet, you just make high-level assumptions on this is probably where my thresholds are and this is what I want to do. Next, let's look at the items that you actually need to protect. So first, ideally you would start with an asset inventory. When I mean assets, I mean the hardware and enterprise assets that you use. So laptops, network devices, mobile devices, and all of these different items. So you would do an inventory. What is the hardware information? Who owns the device? What department do they belong to? And all of these different items you would take note of so that you can know what types of hardware you have in your environment. You would also think about what software you use. What are the vendors that support those? What is the version, the life cycle? What kind of business need do these serve? And do I have support for them or not? You do the same for data. Think about the different classifications you have. And then the accounts. So what are my user accounts? What are my administrative accounts? And take an inventory of what types you have. So if you start this early, I'm going to tell you, you are going to have a massive advantage compared to companies that are already deep into their businesses. In my experience in the industry, asset management is one of the most difficult things to do once you're a big company. Because you have so many devices, so many software, so many different things that were just purchased one-off by different departments that you do not really know about them, you do not really have control over them. So going back retrospectively and documenting all of this is very hard. There are tools out there, but if you can start this as soon as possible when your company is still small, then you can have a good inventory list and you'll know exactly what you have in your environment, and that is to your advantage compared to all these big players. So, all right, so now you know everything you have in your environment, right? We know the hardware, we know the data, we know the software, and we know all the types of accounts we have. So now what? Now you have to think about how you're going to protect it. So let's talk about software and hardware. So these are the items where you're going to start thinking about the different procedures and processes that you want to follow and then put those into different types of controls. So at a minimum, I mentioned already vulnerabilities, right? We saw that for small businesses, vulnerabilities and application attacks are very high on the list. So at a minimum, you should have auto updates and patches for your system. So I mentioned, if you use a Windows device, make sure that those auto updates are turned on. More by mobile device, the same thing. I have the habit of turning that on sometimes because it just bothers me when I'm trying to do something and it takes up all my data. I just noticed that it hasn't been on for me for probably 2 months, so don't do that. Firewalls, very important to protect your data connections when you're communicating with other devices and other online systems. Make sure that you review your default settings. So for example, if you have a router, you want to go and change those default administrative privileges, so accounts. So you do not use default passwords, for example. Attackers know what the Cisco router XYZ default passwords are. Do not use those. IoT devices, same thing. Make sure you change those. Automatic sessions locking, especially if you're in certain types of industries, regulated industries. You have to make sure that if your employees walk away from their computers, those get locked. At a company that I used to work with, it was a healthcare company, at random times, compliance employees would actually be walking around different floors and just randomly check individuals' computers when they walk away to see if they were logged. And if it wasn't, you got a little note, first strike, next one you're out. Mobile device management, as I mentioned, in startups usually, you use, there's a blurry line between what personal and business is. So mobile is often used by startup entrepreneurs. So there's different tools that you can do for mobile device management that can help with that. Antivirus, anti-malware, those are very important to make sure that you have on your devices. For example, make sure, those, again, auto updates to make sure that their databases are updated so that they can catch the newest threats. And of course, when you have removable media, at least, even if you know that you have the need for those types of configurations, at least turn on the auto run. So before anything gets plugged into your device, and maybe it's a malicious device, then your anti-malware or antivirus application can do a scan on it before any malicious files would be able to run off of it. You would probably also create an acceptable use policy, especially as you grow, so that your employees can know what they should or shouldn't do on these devices. You also have the list of software, right? So you would probably think about what those supported software are, what are their browsers, what are the email applications that your employees are allowed to use. Make sure that those connections are not authorized that shouldn't be there. And then, of course, you'll think about some exception processes and how you would mitigate those. A good example is, of course, I've done some research, and I worked in research computing many, many years ago. So in our type of work, it's very common that we would have to deal with systems, applications that are very specific. What I mean is these products often run on very, very old versions of Linux or Microsoft, so patches obviously do not exist, because if we patch them, those applications wouldn't run. But these are applications that manage multi-million-dollar imaging machines or healthcare devices or things like that for research purposes. So it is a foundational product for those researchers that need to use these. However, they are a massive threat to the organization. So in these situations, for example, you may elect to cut them down off the network and just have them isolated so nobody else can access them. So this way, they are not going to receive any kind of threats from the outside world. So this is when we're talking about the minimum, the basics for assets, software and hardware. This is where you probably would want to maybe start calling a friend, because some of these could get complicated, but you can probably still try to do this on your own. When you're talking about data protection, so of course I mentioned that you'll start doing an inventory of the types of data you have. So you would ideally create a data sensitivity, a data classification model. So you'd figure out what are those types of sensitivity levels that your data has. So for example, you have a public website, you have a lot of information about your company, that would be your public data. So that's one category. Then you have your customers, your financials, and all of those records. Those would be the sensitive internal data. And you can have multiple among that spectrum Maybe there's internal, maybe there's highly confidential, you know. If it's, for example, healthcare, you have PHI, personal health information. Those would be highly sensitive. So you categorize them. You think about those different procedures and processes that you have to follow. So you'll think about, how does the data handling look like? How does retention look like? How long do I have to keep the data? In certain types of regulation and industries, you have to keep the data for a certain amount of years. In other, GDPR, for example, if they ask you, you have to delete everything. Disposal, how am I going to get rid of that data? When do I get rid of that data? What happens to it to make sure it's protected and nobody else can pick it up after I dispose of it? You'll come up with data access control lists. So these are those methods that help you figure out who is authorized to access what type of data. So again, if you're talking about healthcare patient data, for example, you probably wouldn't want an IT professional to be able to access those. But you would want your nurses and doctors to be able to look it up when the patient comes, but only if it's their patient, right? So you would figure out how to manage those and have the different lists available. You definitely want to encrypt your sensitive data, ideally all of your data. At least at rest, but generally we're already talking, at least in transit, but ideally at rest as well. And you can get all kinds of tools that you can install for these types of functions. And then you'll start thinking about data segmentation. I mentioned the different sensitivity levels that you may have in your organization, right? You may have public data for your website, and you may have these super sensitive records for your healthcare. So you may decide to segment those so that you can protect them even further. You may not want to use the public data on the same storage location where you have your patient data. And then, of course, because we're talking about ransomware so much these days, you come up with data recovery and backup procedures. So there's all kinds of tools that you could pick up to help you with your backup. And then, of course, you need to make that plan to be able to also recover in case you get some kind of an attack like ransomware. So let's talk about account management a little bit too. So accounts are the accounts that you use to access the systems, right? So you figure out the different policies and procedures that you need to have to make sure that these are useful. So you have your admin and user accounts. You have to figure out how you are going to grant access to your users and then how you're going to revoke that access from your users. You will conduct account and access reviews regularly because even though you have a policy for revoking access, maybe something happened and somebody accidentally stayed in one of your healthcare systems and they still have access even though they left the organization. Ideally, your actual credentials, their actual credentials wouldn't work anymore, but maybe their account is still on one of those systems. So you want to do reviews on those systems every year at least to make sure that you know who should or shouldn't be still having access to those. Of course, you set up very strong password policies. There's a lot of good resources out there on how to do that. And then, at a minimum, multi-factor authentication, because passwords, even when it's configured well, they are still potentially cracked. So you have that additional layer that is based on something that you have. So for example, a text message that it can confirm that yes, indeed, it's you. And of course, you ideally would do this centrally so that there's no way that somebody can go around and impact the integrity, the eye of your data. And now let's talk a little bit about securing your network, because this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. This is where you definitely want to get the audience's help and call maybe some of those experts. So when we're talking about protecting your network infrastructures, there's a couple of things that I want to mention. First of all, VPN. If you have remote workers, or pretty much anywhere, you know, being a startup, you probably work from coffee shops, co-working places. So you don't necessarily always know what their controls are. You may connect to a public Wi-Fi, so make sure you have your own VPN so that any traffic you conduct on that Wi-Fi is protected. VPN is virtual private network. It's going to create this little control around you if you're kind of in a bubble, nobody can see what's that traffic between you and another person. You make sure that, of course, we talked about the hardware before, but I want to reiterate, you make sure that all of your network devices and all of your software that you use to support your network are up to date. Again, patching, it's very important. You should always do that as soon as the patches are available. You would do secure protocols. So HTTPS, for example, and I'm not going to get into what the acronyms are. It's everybody uses them like that. So HTTPS is, so when you go to a public website and you want to put financial information in, you want to enter your credit card, you got to make sure that on the browser you always see that HTTPS, because that means that your connection is private and it's protected. That means your financial information is not going to be exposed to outside threats, because that traffic, that transaction is locked, it's protected. So, for example, you have a company and you have a website where you allow your customers to purchase different products, right? So you got to make sure that that public-facing website is configured with those types of configurations like HTTPS, so that you're protecting your customers. Payment card best practices. This is where it gets a little more complicated. There's your financial partners can probably help with those, probably your bank, especially if you're taking financial transactions, credit cards, through credit cards, then you probably have to follow PCI, payment card industry controls. So whoever is helping you with those payments can probably help you walk you through on that process as well. And then, as I talked about segmentation of your data, you ideally start doing that for your network as well. As you grow and as you mature, you're going to start thinking about, well, I want to have a separate sub-network for what I'm doing with my sensitive data, and then what I'm doing on this public website that everybody can come to from the internet and from the world is not in that same segment, so that I can protect that transaction and the data cannot infiltrate from that public realm into the sensitive one. You, of course, think about what your network diagrams will look like. And again, this is where you're going to get the experts' help, because you have other things to worry about as a startup owner. To make sure that those documentations exist, because if there's any kind of change that you need to do to the network, or your IT employee leaves, and then you need to bring somebody new in, you want to make sure that that traceability, that history of what has been done is there, so they don't have to start from scratch. And then on top of that, especially as you grow and your network matures, you're going to start doing things like SIM, so information and event management. This helps you gather data from all kinds of sources so that you can detect and analyze and potentially respond to any kind of situations that happen within your organization. So imagine this as this central repository that pulls data from all kinds of different places, that looks at what your network is looking like, what your systems are doing, and then all of that is aggregated to this big, massive data repository. And then with the help of these tools, they can help you based on some patterns that they use. They can help you figure out what's going on in your organization. And then you'll think about intrusion detection, maybe even intrusion prevention systems. And of course, with the SIM, you will need to be able to collect all your network traffic logs as well, which is, again, if you think about the CIA, it really helps with the integrity of your data as well, because now you know where, what happened, and you can go back if there's any kind of situation with your data being not correct. All right, so we talked about the technical. Good, that's over. Oh, that was rough, right? It's actually really fun. Once you start thinking about it and you understand your risks and you think about the methodology I'm sharing with you, it's really not that complicated. So let's go back to that statistic I showed you, the 74% human. That is unfortunately one of our biggest problems. We just can't control humans that well. So security awareness should be one of your top priorities as well. So again, we talked about threats, right? And then we talked about risk. We talked about what your assets are, how you should control them. And now I want to talk about the human, because that is one of the biggest risks in your environment. As I mentioned, phishing, vishing, and all of those tools, social engineering, they can really easily result in one of your employees' credentials being leaked or stolen by a threat actor. When we're talking about social engineering, I want to share a brief story. I read a really good book about a guy that's an expert in social engineering, and he actually does this for a living. And just so you understand how social engineering happens. So he figured out who the CIO of the company, he was asked to do this, okay? So he's a white hat hacker, white hat social engineer. He was asked to do this for the company. So he figured out what the CIO of the company likes to do. He figured out what coffee shop he goes to, so he ended up frequenting that coffee shop to be able to run into him. He sat down to the next table, they started talking, they made a little friendship, right? The CIO shared with him that, oh, I'm going to Barbados on this vacation. I don't know where he was going exactly. And I'm going to be gone, but you know what, maybe, so they shared some information, right? Because it's a trusting person. I don't see no threat. It's just a coffee shop conversation. So he shared all of this information with him. So now, the social engineering threat actor, the person that was hired to do this test, he figured out that, okay, this is the time when the CIO is going to be away from the office. So during that time, he came to the office, went to the administrator and said, I'm here to meet this and this. To go in. She's like, oh no, it's just, of course. So she let him in. He put a flash drive into the toilet or into the bathroom so that one of the employees would pick it up. Of course, they picked it up, put it into the systems, into one of the computers, and it started the attack. So it's that simple. It's that simple because we're trusting humans. We believe in situations. We believe in people. We do not immediately assume. So it's that simple to manipulate somebody into doing some kind of an action. So that's social engineering. So when you're thinking about the human risk, you have to educate your employees about these types of situations. Another thing that you should talk to them about is authentication, how to do that, how they should be using their passwords, what are safe practices, and all of that. Data handling is another one. Obviously, I talked about it a little bit earlier. There's policies and procedures that you now put in place. So now you want to educate your employees about how to do that. How do you protect that data? Make sure that when you have a new employee, this is what you do. When it's about unintentional exposure, so when they unintentionally do something wrong, warn them about how that may look like. So again, related to social engineering and all these other things, but also I accidentally misplaced a flash drive or something. So all of those things need to be, the individuals need to be educated on. And then of course, how they can recognize and report when something goes wrong, even if it's not them, make sure that those get reported so you can do something about it early. And then again, networking and how to be safe online. So for example, educating them about VPN and making sure that they follow those procedures that you've put in place and those controls that you implemented. Okay, so we know the threats. We understand, at least to some level, what our risks are. We know the different assets we have in our environment. We have some controls and policies and procedures in place. We educated our employees, and we still got breached. And we have this saying in cybersecurity industry that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. You're going to have eventually some kind of situation, and that is why your response and your capability for response is very important. So, because if you know what to do, even though there's a situation and an incident that may happen to your organization, then you're going to be able to respond quickly and mitigate so that the least amount of negative outcome will happen from that situation. So, what I mean by response is that, of course, you'll have an incident response plan. So, who are the individuals involved? How's that going to look like? And then an incident responding process as well. So again, I mentioned in the human risk, when we're talking about security awareness, you have to have this policy in place. Like, how do the individuals need to report incidents? How's that going to look like? Who are the contacts? And making sure that they know what those are. So communicate about those. And of course, when we talked about data a little bit earlier, and I mentioned that you'll have those backups and recovery procedures in place, you want to test those as well. Because it's great to have a plan, but if it doesn't work, the ransomware is not going to let you get your data back. So, quiz time. I'm an educator, so I'm going to quiz you. So we talked about the CIA triangle, right? I'm curious if you can tell me what would passwords constitute? Confidentiality, integrity, or availability? Confidentiality? Okay. Yeah, both, because confidentiality is to protect, right? But also, if you have a password and a user account, then you can log in and get access to the data. Disaster recovery and backups. Integrity. Okay, good, yes. Integrity and availability. Yeah, right, because ransomware, if you have backups, no problem. Let them have it. Well, still not good, but security patches, again, you know, updating your Windows software every time when the update comes out. Okay, good. Integrity, yeah, that too, yeah, because now the vulnerability is not there, so you can protect that data. There's a lot of overlap, by the way. So, access control lists. Okay, all right, good, good, good. Air gapping, and I didn't talk about this, I should have. Air gapping is when you, well, I did mention the, you know, the old research tool that they use, and you want to make sure it's separated. So not just off the network, but completely locked down with access so that only certain people are authorized to get in there. Yeah, confidentiality, maybe also integrity. What about audit logs? So this is that information that you're able to pull so that you know what happened. Integrity, okay. And then network monitoring. Okay, all right. So now you're starting to see, you know, how the CIA ties into all of these different controls and techniques that you can use. So let's talk a little bit about as you grow, so maturity. And I'm not going to show you any actual maturity models because I would need to talk to you about cybersecurity much more before we do that. But when you start out, you're very small, and I mentioned some of those situations that you face as a small business, as a startup, you know, like the gray areas between laptop and small and low resources. So, you know, you'll probably go with off-the-shelf tools. You're still small, again, your company, you don't have specific expertise in cybersecurity. You're trying to do everything on your own, right? And then you get further into the growth process. You may start having responsible IT individuals that they help you with the different things that you're trying to do. You'll start focusing more on the regulatory aspects of your business. And, you know, your operations get a little bit more complex. So this is where you're going to start getting those external resources and help, bringing in IT individuals, maybe consultants to help with that journey. And then, of course, when you get on the other end, when we're very mature, again, regulatory compliance assessments, regulatory assessments are very important for you. This is when you're going to have multiple different cybersecurity experts. So you have specifically somebody doing vulnerability management for you. You will have somebody who's in the security operations center responding to actual incidents. You will have somebody who's working on the risk side for you. So you are getting very deep into those specific areas of cybersecurity, and you really start focusing on the calculations of risk and making the risk component being the foundation of what you're doing as an organization in terms of cybersecurity. Again, I put risk at the beginning because in the industry what we've seen is people start with the controls. But if you do not know why you're doing things, then you probably won't know what control you actually need to put in place. What I mean by that is maybe this is not even a threat today, and you're trying to put in a control for it, spending a bunch of money. So that is why the risk is very important to start thinking about early, because at the end of the day, what is cybersecurity? Yes, it's about CIA, but it's really about mitigating your risk of an attack, right? So that is why the more mature an organization gets, and I think that's why you are in a good position if you're here early in your journey, because the bigger the organization, the more and more controls they have, the more they have to start thinking about risk as well, because there's a lot of money at stake, right? And I think in my industry experience, I've seen it a lot that risk comes maybe second, when in reality that should really drive you. So when we're talking about maturity, again, I mentioned, you're becoming very, very, very risk focused. Again, the regulatory compliance and making sure that the regulations you're following up and you're knowing what those are and doing regular self-assessments as well. Am I ready for HIPAA? You actually have to do those regularly when you're in certain industries. So your vulnerability management, I mentioned that you'll have dedicated staff in cybersecurity for those specific areas of cybersecurity, which there is a lot. So you'll end up doing these vulnerability management tasks as well, in a much more robust manner. You'll do automated scans and remediations. You buy different tools that can help, and you may even have a team that's going to help with remediating that. You will start thinking about how you develop your software. If you're in a software business already, then you probably have to start with that too. But the bigger you grow, the more you're going to start thinking about maybe building things in-house as well. So you will start thinking about how that software development process needs to look like, and you'll get into more robust methodologies that can help you with that. Penetration testing is probably going to become something very significant as well as you grow, and especially in certain industries when it's required, you have to start doing those. And then the third and fourth part, the risk, is something that you will have to start thinking about. Because as you mature, obviously, the different partners and contractors that you work with is going to just keep growing. And that is also a very important aspect. So especially if you have certain regulatory requirements that you have to meet, then you're also responsible for your suppliers, your vendors, and all of that. So third party is the vendor that works for you, so the contractors that work for you. Fourth party is the vendors of the vendors, so everybody that comes down from that. So you're responsible who you partner with, and anything that they do will reflect badly on you. So you have to think about, what are those vendors I'm working with? What do they stand for? What do their policies look like? How should my policies look like working with them? And of course, considering those in your contracting language. So I have an example that I'd like to share. There was a situation where I worked for a company. It was in healthcare. And we were working on security awareness for third-party providers. So these were healthcare workers that were coming in to support us through a third party. So they were not our own employees, but because the regulations required that we had security awareness training conducted for them, we had this conversation with our legal team. Okay, what are we going to do? We decided to do that training in-house. There was a change in leadership in the legal team, and somehow the miscommunication happened, and all of this material was created so that we can train these individuals. And then the legal team said, well, we're not going to roll this out. Well, why not? Well, because they're responsible for this training. And I was very, very frustrated, because I get it. We're trying to transfer the risk over to the third party, right? But we are still responsible for it ultimately. So how do we assure that that training actually happens? So what the legal team should have done is gone back to the contract with that third party and said, it's up for renewal at this time. So when we renew, we are going to have this clause included in that contract to make sure you have to do this and this type of training, because we're holding you accountable, because we're accountable. So you understand what I mean by risk. We decided in that situation that, okay, we're going to transfer that risk to that guy, but we didn't assure that there was any kind of contract between the two of us to assure that they're actually going to do that. So if they decided to not do that, we had no recourse. So again, cybersecurity and risk, you also see how I'm talking about legal stuff here. So you hopefully have a good lawyer who also understands some of those compliance and regulatory requirements that happen in your industry, because that's also very important. So to sum it up, that's the 7 steps I'm going to repeat here. So threats, we understand where the threats are coming from. We thought about the risk, what we're willing to lose, what we have to do in terms of regulations. And then, maybe we start thinking about those little diagrams and just maybe calling something a red versus a green in terms of risk. Then we talk about our assets, right? We inventoried all those assets. We know what we have in our environment. And because we're starting early, we're at an advantage compared to all those big players, because now they have to figure out those 10 million software tools that they have and that they don't know exists. So then we talk about the processes and controls. We figure out what those processes will look like, how we're going to implement them, and what those controls will be in terms of the cybersecurity controls. Then we'll consider the network, especially as we grow. We'll maybe get some we'll get some outside experts to come in, help with that. You figure out how you're going to deal with your human risk. You educate your employees. You make sure they're trained properly so they don't do situations like plugging an unknown USB device into their computers. And then you have a plan. So if anything goes wrong, you'll know how to respond. So you do all of this, and then you're probably on the right track to mature and get into a good situation where compliance and regulations and the safety of your data will not be a problem. To just finish up with a couple of tips from personal experience, I also want to add that, of course, we started with a lot of information here, but just start with the basics. So again, you understand what you have, but when you get to those controls, don't freak out. There's a lot of things to do. But if you start with the basics, such as patches, such as turning things on automatically, such as changing basic things like your default passwords, you're already doing a lot. VPN, it's very easy to buy VPN. All of these things are very simple that you can do on your own, and you're already doing a lot to protect that data. Follow a framework. There's a lot of frameworks out there. I highly recommend the CIS controls, which is created by the Center for Internet Security. It is a control that I like to use. It is actually where I got some of the ideas for the flow from with my own tweaks. But the CIS controls are a very, very simple, easy to digest, non-super technical, just a couple of, it's long, but it's very clearly, every control is described in just a couple of sentences so that you can figure out what you need to do. And it actually helps you think about even how you mature. So these are the things you should start with. If you mature, this is what you do. And then when you're a grown, stable enterprise, you really need to get into that. So follow a framework. It can really help you with that. There are some other frameworks as well that I want to mention, NIST and HITRUST and all of those. So NIST, I'm not saying, I'm listing them because they're important. I probably wouldn't start there if I'm starting out, because they're just so complicated to digest at first. And if you're starting out and you just read and understand the basics of CIS, I think you're already in a good place that you'll be able to demonstrate the things that you need to demonstrate for even your regulators. And of course, get that outside help, get those cybersecurity experts to help you. Maybe you want to build a strategy from scratch, get somebody in that can help you put these steps into action and figure out what are those things that you need to do. And of course, I talked about that maturity. Think about how you're going to grow and how is that going to look like as you mature, and how is that sustainability and scalability going to look like. So I also created this little 7 steps cheat sheet for you. I will be posting this on my LinkedIn. So the QR code over there has my LinkedIn profile if you want to just follow or send an invite or whatever. It's going to be posted there later today, so you can have it downloaded and just use it as a cheat sheet. It has some of the links and information to some of the items that I've talked about. So it has links to Verizon and some of these cool tools that you can consult that could help you on the journey. And this is what I had for you today. Any questions? Thank you. Okay, yeah.
How far should a small business trust a cloud provider to offload some of that risk?
Depends. So when we're talking about cybersecurity, you actually have a shared responsibility model, which means that the cloud provider is responsible for the infrastructure itself. So like, meaning the data center is up and running, the data center itself is protected, but anything you build on the cloud, so the applications and tools you deploy, it's your responsibility. So if it's a SaaS product, then I would, depends what that SaaS product is. I would look through they probably, if it's a SaaS product, they have to have certifications. So if you, for example, can search for their ISO certifications or high trust certifications or any kind of certification, if they're healthcare SaaS vendor, for example, they probably have some kind of certification that is from healthcare. So those are a good indication that they have checked the boxes and they're doing the right thing.
All right. Any other questions? Oh, is this working? Okay.
Thanks for your presentation. That's a lot of information. I have one particular question. You talked about. Hold it closer?
Yeah, there we go.
All right. MDM, mobile device management. That is like the primary go-to device that people are using in any
Yes.
small business.
Yes.
Do you have any recommendations on something that they could do? Like I've heard that, swap out your SIMS card
Yeah.
and delete apps that you don't use, get a separate phone for business versus personal. So do you have any advice on that?
I mean, the straightest answer is, yeah, of course, if you separate them, that's the ideal world. But most people, do not want to carry two cell phones, and that's complicated and expenses and whatever. So that's why MDM can help. So they can help you segment your mobile device so that you technically have two platforms on the same device. So, you have one environment that is your personal data, your personal applications and whatnot, and then whatever you use for work is completely separate. It's on the same device, but it's completely separated and protected in its own little bucket with the work-related applications and tools that you may want to use. So you can configure it in a way, like for example on my cell phone, I cannot even copy information from my work segment to the personal one because it's configured in a way that copy-paste, for example, is not enabled. So there's all kinds of tools that exist in the industry that you can use for that. For bigger companies, for example, if you use Microsoft, for example, Intune is a common tool that companies like to use just because it's a Microsoft. So if you use like O365 services, for example, that would be a straightforward answer. But again, it depends on your environment, obviously, what you have and what kind of tools you use. So you don't necessarily have to have a separate device as long as you have some kind of an MDM or tool that will be able to help you create that separation on the phone itself.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. So just some housekeeping. We'll wait first. Let's get a round of applause. One final round of applause. Yes, thank you, thank you.